This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Hello everyone and welcome to a new tutorial. Today we're getting back to creating some motion design. Let's take a look at what we're going to be creating. As you may have guessed, this was heavily inspired by the Ubisoft logo animation, but there are plenty of other concepts out there that are based around this spiral zoom effect. The project files are available for download in the description. Even so, I would highly recommend that you stick around until the end of the tutorial because there could always be something new for you to learn. With all that said, let's jump right in and get started. Alright, so here we are now in After Effects, and before we get started from scratch, let's quickly take a look at all of the original comps that we have down here. So first of all, we have this line comp, and I think this is the main element of this entire effect. And this was created using a shape layer with a line, some trim paths effect, and some optics compensations effect on top with an adjustment layer. And you'll be seeing this effect used throughout this entire tutorial. Next to that, we have this stars comp, which is made up of these two layers. So we have some small stars, and then we have some big stars. And to generate these, I use the CC starburst effect together with an echo effect to get these line streaks. Next up, we have this sort of fractal noise spiral. And then finally, we have this cylinder element, which is using this huge texture comp. So if we right click, go to composition settings, you can see the width is 1920, but the height is 10,000. And I just pre-composed that as a texture, which again is using a fractal noise. And finally, we're turning that into a cylinder by using the CC cylinder effect. And once we recreate all of these elements, we're finally gonna composite them back together in this main comp, which we're gonna also add some effects on top of it, and then finally colorize it and also mix it up with this logo at the end. By the way, when I look at this, it reminds me of this anime show called Naruto. You've probably heard of it. And not to spoil or anything, but there's this character on the show that sucks people in with his eye abilities and teleports them into this other dimension. There's a moment in the show where he just sucks everybody in and just kills them all, and the show ends. I guess I should have said spoiler alert, but who knows, I might not even be telling the truth. Or am I? I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I could rename this tutorial to match the character ability's name, and hopefully that should suck people into watching this tutorial. Anyway, let's go back to the project panel, and before we create a new comp, just make sure we're set to 32 bits per channel, because again, we're going to be colorizing this all the way at the end, and we're going to use a bunch of glow effects, so we want those highlights and those shadows to clip properly. And to toggle between that, we can hold down Alt and just click on it, and you can see the difference. So let's Alt click and just go over to 32 bits per channel, and we have these sweet looking glow effects. Let's now create a new composition by going up to Composition, New Composition, and we'll rename this to Line just for consistency, so it's the same as what we had before, but we'll just add tut for tutorial, so we know this is the tutorial version of the comp. And let's just set the height to 1080, frame rate of 30 seems fine, and a duration of 30, and finally hit OK. Now let's select the rectangle tool. And by the way, if you don't see this, you can either hold down the left mouse button and this will reveal all the other shapes. So you can choose whatever you want, or you can click Q to toggle between them. So if we hit Q constantly, you can see toggles between the different shapes. But let's just make sure we're on the rectangle tool, and now we can double click on it, and this will create a perfect rectangle based on our comp settings. Now we can drop down the contents of the rectangle, and you can see the fill is already checked off, but we'll just delete it. And then we'll right click on the rectangle path and convert to Bezier path. So if we toggle the masks now, you can see we have this mask that we can modify. So if we hit G to bring up the pen tool, we can select these points. So we'll go back to the selection tool by hitting V, and we'll select these bottom points and just hit delete. So now we're left with only these 2 points that make up this line. Now we'll select the layer, hit Ctrl Alt Home to center the anchor point to the layer, and then Ctrl Home to center the layer to the composition. And we'll just hit return, rename this to line. Now we'll go down to the stroke and make sure this is white, because we're only going to be using grayscale values, and then introduce the color all the way at the end. Now we can maybe increase the stroke width to, I don't know, maybe 100. Next up, let's add an effect called twist. And if we increase this, we get this sort of spiral effect. Now, there's a slight problem with this, and that is the entire line is being twisted. What we need is to cut off one side of the line. And to do that, we can go to add and add a trim paths effect. And if we drop this down, we can decrease the end until we're at, I don't know, maybe 25%. And what happens is now we're only seeing one side of the line. And now what we can do is animate the end to have the line come in and then animate the start to have it disappear like so. You get the idea. But we'll work on that once we get to the animation stage. So we'll set this back to 25%. Now let's go over to layer, new adjustment layer, and we'll control space to bring up FX console. And I've talked about this on my other videos, but it is a third-party plugin from videocopilot.net which allows you to hit control space and bring up this menu and then type in whatever effect you're looking for. So in this case, optics compensation, and then just hit return to add it to your layer. Now the optics compensation effect allows you to give your layers this sort of fisheye look. So if we increase the field of view and then maybe play around with the view center, you can see what that does. Now we'll control Z to bring that back to the center, and we'll make sure we reverse the lens distortion. And now if we increase the field of view, you can see that gives us this sort of zoomed in look. So what we'll do is set this to 90. Then we can go over to edit, duplicate, or use Control D, which I highly encourage people to always learn as many shortcuts as possible. So we'll click on that. And now what we can do is increase this even more to say, I don't know, maybe 130. And then maybe set a keyframe here and go over to maybe 3 seconds. You can hold down Alt and use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out of the timeline. And I don't know, the length really depends on you, but maybe we'll go over to 3 seconds and we'll increase this to 150 maybe, and then maybe go over to 3.5 seconds and we'll give this like 160. So it goes crazy all the way at the end. If we hit U, we can bring up all of the keyframes, and maybe we can select this one and hit F9. So it just takes a bit of time to get started. Now we're not seeing so much action as it is. So what we'll do is select the line and we'll hit R to bring up the rotation. And we could either animate it manually by hitting the stopwatch and then going over and then maybe increase this. But what we'll do is let's Control Z and we'll Alt click on the stopwatch to add an expression. And we'll type in time times 500. And this means that every second, this layer will rotate by 500 degrees. And we can see that if we go over to 1 second, there's an entire cycle, which is 360 degrees plus 140. That makes up for 500. And now if we preview this, you can see we get this sort of spiral hypnotic look. Now we're also noticing that there isn't a lot of lines being bent. So what we can do is go down to the contents one more time and find the twist effect. And I believe in the original version, I just cranked this up to like 5,000. And of course, we can't really see anything now because it's blown out to bits. But if we go over to the rectangle stroke, there's a taper option here, which allows you to make either the start or the end of your line to be thicker or thinner. So what we'll do is set the end length to 100% and then the end ease to 50%. We're just trying to make the line thicker towards the edges here. And then as it goes to the center, it gets thinner and thinner. So we'll set this back to 50%. Now to have the line come in at the start, once again, we'll go back to the trim paths effect as I showed you before. So we'll find that, drop that down. We can first animate the end value. So we'll set a keyframe here at the start and we'll go over to maybe 15 frames. And if we just drop this down, you can see it just goes way too quick. So in order to have finer control over it, we can hold down Control. And this allows you to adjust the value in 0.1 increments. So we can now really dial that in until we no longer see it. So 20.8%. Of course, this has to be on the other side. So we can either swap them like this, or if we Control Z, we can select these keyframes, right click, keyframe assistant, time reverse keyframes. So that's a really quick way to reverse a couple of keyframes. And now if we preview this, we can see it just comes in like that. Now, of course, we can also select this and maybe ease that. And maybe even just bring it all the way over to 2 seconds and then right click on it, adjust the incoming velocity. So we'll set it to like 75%. And if we just preview that, it comes in really quick and then slowly comes to a stop. And if we zoom in here, we can actually drop this down lower so we don't get to see the entire line because that gives us this sort of very slow looking illusion. So we'll drop this down a bit, maybe to that point. And now we'll preview it one more time. So you can see now it feels a lot faster. And maybe we'll go back to this and just control click on this so it turns back to a linear keyframe, and maybe even tweak the timing of this at the end. And now what we'll do is, as soon as it starts gaining speed even more at the end here, we'll go over to maybe 215. And now we can increase the start value, so it just cuts off the other end of the line. But we also have to drop down the stroke width so we don't get any weird results. So we'll set a keyframe for the stroke width. We'll also set a keyframe for the start value. We'll bring this back to 0, by the way. And now, I don't know, maybe 215. We'll bring all these keyframes there. Hit U, by the way, to just show the keyframes so it's a bit cleaner on the composition timeline. And now we can go over to 315 maybe. Now we can increase the start value. Just make sure we don't go on the other side, 24.5, and also decrease the stroke width to go down to 0%. Now we might have to mess around with the timing a bit here, so we'll maybe select the start value and then hit easy ease on that, so hit F9, just to make sure it starts coming in earlier. And then maybe we'll drop this over like so, and then right click keyframe velocity, and we'll do 75%. And then we'll also bring this over, so it starts cutting off a bit earlier, and then eventually we get to see that transition like so. So it's just a very quick animation all the way at the end here. Again, play around with the timing to get the desired effect. So maybe let's go over here, hit F9 on that, and maybe easy ease this as well. And I mention this a lot, but whenever I'm doing tutorials, it's very rare that the end result is going to look the same as the original example. Because, you know, the pressure is on, we're doing it live, and now we have to look as if we know what we're doing. But do we though? What we can do now is maybe hit S to bring up the scale as well. And we'll animate the scale towards the end here. So we'll go over to 215, and then we'll set a keyframe there. And as we're going towards the end here, we can maybe scale this down, so we get this impression as if it's being sucked in even more. And maybe we can even select this and easy ease that. And by the way, I've been using the keyframe velocity up until now. You can even use the graph editor here. But what I like to do instead is use this flow plugin, which is a third-party paid plugin, which you don't really need. But what it allows you to do is to just save these presets of the keyframe velocities and just select keyframes. And then in this case, say I want to give it 75%, I'll just double click on that. And now if we right click, go to keyframe velocity, you can see the incoming and outgoing velocity are set to 75%. Now, one last detail I want to do is to go over to layer, new, null object. And let's just quickly rename this to distort and this one to end extra rotation. And what I did in the original example is to just parent the line to this layer. And then towards the end here, as it's starting to disappear, what we can do is hit R to bring up the rotation, and then hit the stopwatch to set a keyframe, and then go over to maybe 4 seconds and just spin this over by a full cycle. And we'll F9 these, and we'll also make them 75%. So what happens is, as it's going at the end, it's gonna give it one last very quick spin. Maybe we'll drag this over. Remember, this is just trial and error, so feel free to experiment around. All right, so I think we're pretty much done with this element. So we'll come back to it and render it later on once we have every element set up. Now let's create a new comp. So we can click that icon down there, and we'll rename this to stars, tut, hit OK. Let's create a new solid, so layer, new solid, or Ctrl+Y, and we'll rename this to stars, and hit OK. Now we'll control space to bring up the FX console once again, and we'll add a fractal noise effect. Now we'll also control space to add a CC starburst effect. And just so you know, the CC starburst effect takes the colors of your layer and applies them to these particles. So that's why we added the fractal noise effect. And if we switch back to full, we can maybe zoom in here. And if we turn this off, seeing as our solid is pure white, you can see all of these dots are pure white. But what we can do is just turn the fractal noise on, and the CC starburst effect will sample the colors from that texture. Now we can maybe increase the contrast. So if we toggle the transparency, you can see we have some black dots and then some white dots and then some gray dots. And these random grayscale values will come in handy once we get to the colorization stage. Now onto the CC starburst effect values. First of all, we have the scatter, which if we just increase this, it just scatters the particles in space. And we'll set this to, I don't know, maybe 500. Next up, we have speed, and this determines how fast they're moving, so it's the velocity of the particles. And if we increase this in the positive, once we scrub in the timeline, you can see they're flying towards the camera. But what we want instead is to have them fly away from the camera. So we'll go over to -3, and I'll quickly demonstrate it. So let's go over to layer, new adjustment layer. Let's just uncheck the transparency and add a optics compensation effect real quick, and just increase this. So they're flying away from the camera. So you get the idea. Now let's just delete that. Then we have the phase, which is just controlling the point of animation. Next to that, we have the grid spacing, and the higher this is, the more spread out the particles are gonna be. So we'll set this to maybe 4, and then we have size. So this just controls the size of these particles. So we'll just leave it at default, so 100. And now we have this particle field. Now to get those streak lines that we had before, what we can do is add the echo effect. And what this does is just echoes the effect either in the positive or the negative seconds. So if we set this to like a very low value, so like 0.003, the echo is going to be very tight. And we'll switch back to full. By the way, be prepared to have your PC explode once we increase the number of echoes here. So if we just bring the number of echoes to maybe say 50, we get this insane trail of stars, and this kind of reminds me of Star Wars actually. Now, seeing as we have the increments very low here, that means that the echo is happening very close to each other. In turn, we have these lines. Now, of course, you can still see some splitting right here at the end, but this is not going to be visible once we apply all of the distortion effects, so that's not really a problem. Now, let's also take a look at a few more options we have here. So we have the starting intensity. And just for the sake of our PC not exploding, let's just switch to quarter. And the starting intensity is basically how visible all of these echo instances are. So we'll leave that at 1. But if we decrease the decay, we get this sort of faded trail. So let's just set it to like 0.95. And then finally, we have the echo operator, which in this case, it really doesn't make a big difference. Now let's rename this to small stars. And then we'll hit Ctrl D to duplicate, and we'll rename this to big stars. And let's solo that out for a moment. And what we'll do is go to the CC Starburst and just play around with a few settings here. First of all, we'll set the size to maybe 400 or so. And by the way, I believe that's like as far as you can go. So if I just scroll here, you can see it locks over to 400. Then we can maybe increase the phase to get like a random point in the animation, just to give it some variation. And maybe increase the number of echoes here. So we'll do 100, so we have bigger trails as well. Just remember that as you increase this value, the render time increases drastically as well. Now we're having a slight problem here. There's just way too many stars. And if we just bring this in with the small stars as well, it's just way too overwhelming. So in order to control the amount of stars we have, we could maybe play around with the grid spacing and see what happens. But what we can do to have better control over it is to use a Venetian blinds effect. So if you control space, type in Venetian blinds and bring this all the way at the top here. And we'll turn off the CC starburst effect and the echo effect and the fractal noise effect for that matter. So what we can do here is if we increase this transition completion, we're cutting off the layer with these blinds. And so in turn, the CC starburst effect is now sourcing less pixels. And as a result, giving us less particles. So you can see without Venetian blinds, there's a lot more particles. And then with Venetian blinds, there's less particles. And we can maybe bring this down to like 50%. All right, now, as I said at the beginning, the line element is sort of the main element. So we're gonna base all of the other elements timing around this. So this was, I don't know, 3.5 seconds long. So what we'll do is set these to be 5 seconds long. So we'll go over to 5 seconds, hit star to set a marker on your composition, and then we can hit end to bring the work area end. And so we know we're gonna only need to render this section. Again, we only need 3.5 seconds, but for good measure, we'll just set it to 5 seconds instead. And we'll come back and render all of these elements later on. So we'll move on. Let's just create a new comp, and we'll call this Fractal Spiral Tut. Hit OK. Let's go to Layer, New Solid. Rename this to Fractal Spiral. Hit Enter. We'll Control Space, add a fractal noise. And we'll increase the contrast to maybe 400. And we don't really need to play around with these settings. Next up, what we'll do is add an effect called polar coordinates. And what this does is if we increase the interpolation and switch the type of conversion to rect to polar, it just distorts your image into a perfect circle like so. Then we can maybe add a twirl effect. And then if we increase the angle, you can see what that does. It's just twirling the entire texture. Maybe we'll set it like 15. So we'll go crazy with it and we'll switch back to full so we can see what's going on. And we'll set this to 0. And also make sure the twirl radius is set to 100 so it covers the entire layer. Now we also need to give it that zoomed in look. So we'll go over to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And we'll add the optics compensation effect. Increase this until the edges here are filled in. So we'll do 130 maybe. We'll also go back to the fractal spiral layer. We'll hit R and we'll alt click on this and give it the same expression that we did to the line. So we'll do time times 500, and we can maybe even go to the evolution and alt click on that and also give that time times 500. So even the texture changes. So if we turn these effects off, you can see not only is it rotating, so maybe you can disable that, the texture is also changing. I don't know, maybe we'll do 250 on this, and we'll also retype in the expression and turn the effects back on. Now we'll go back to the optics compensation and maybe increase it even further. Maybe go back to full just to see how that's looking. All right, now let's quickly animate the twirl angle as well. So we'll set a keyframe here at the start, hit U to show that keyframe, and we'll bring it at the start here, and we'll go over to 5 seconds, and we'll set this to maybe 20. So it also keeps twirling. So it's this really crazy looking animation. Now, one thing that does bother me is the center here, which is all distorted. And what we can do is to go over to Layer, New Solid, type in Matte, bring this above the fractal spiral. We can hit F4 to toggle the switches or just click on this button. And this will show up the track matte. And what we can do is set this to alpha inverted matte. And we'll select the matte and we'll switch back to the ellipse tool and just click on the middle here. Hold down Control and Shift. And this will make a perfect circle for you. And we'll just scale it up like so. And then we'll hit F, bring up the feather and just increase the feather a little bit. All right, so that's the spiral element done. Now let's take a look at the final one, which is the cylinder. So we'll create a new comp, type in cylinder texture, make sure the height is set to 10,000 and hit OK. Then we'll create a new solid, name this fractal, add the fractal noise effect. Now let's increase the contrast a little bit. And now we'll go back to the project panel. We'll click and drag this into a new comp. And let's just quickly rename this to cylinder only. And we'll also set this to be 1080p. So now we have this cylinder texture comp inside of our cylinder comp. Now we can control space, type in cylinder. And by the way, this effect actually works with built-in After Effects cameras. So if we quickly create a new camera, you can see, go back to the active camera view, by the way. You can see if we spin around here, you can actually control the angle. But what I like to do instead is to just use the rotation properties that are built into the effect. So we'll spin the X rotation to -90. And you can also play around with the radius here. Now, before we do anything else, let's just go over to light and just turn the light intensity down to 0. So our texture doesn't get affected by any lighting. And also go down to shading and set the ambient to 100%. So it's now just a flat 3D cylinder with no shading. Now we do have a slight problem here. And that is this seam that you see down here at the bottom. And that's because our texture, which is the fractal noise, is not tiled, obviously. And maybe we can not even worry about it. Maybe just skip it because we're going to add all of those distortion effects all the way at the end. And maybe this won't be as visible. But just to quickly show you how we would go about fixing this, let's turn off the CC cylinder effect. And we'll hit Ctrl D to duplicate. And we'll shut off this one at the bottom. And we'll add an effect called offset. We'll put that above the CC cylinder. Shift the X value to the center here until we can see the seam. So we'll do 1920 just so we know we're at the center of the comp as well. And now we'll turn the original copy back on and we'll select this one at the top. We'll double click on the rectangle tool. And remember, this creates a perfect rectangle mask based on our comp settings. And now we can double click on the mask so we can transform it. And now if we hold down Control, we can scale this down just a bit. And now if we also hit F to bring up the feather and increase that feather, you see we have this very feathered edge, so we can no longer notice that. And so what's happening is we're locating that seam using the offset value, and now we're masking it out. And so now once we turn our cylinder effect back on for both of these and turn this back to full, you can see we no longer have that seam. Hey guys, Future Miran here. I just want to quickly clarify a mistake that I made. You don't necessarily need to duplicate this comp and add the CC cylinder effect on both of those and do the tiling here. Instead, what you could do is go inside of the texture comp itself and then duplicate this, add the offset to this texture. So we'll do 1920. Then we'll zoom out, add a mask to this, scale it up, isolate it like so, and then feather it out. This way you're taking care of the tiling in the actual texture comp itself. And then back here, you only need one copy of the CC cylinder effect. And we can turn the distortion back off and then we can go back to full resolution. And as you can see, the seam is gone. So turn this off, there's the seam, and then Control Z, there is no seam. But don't mind me now, back to the original tutorial. Now let's also create an adjustment layer to add all of our final distortion effects. Let's control space, type in twirl. Now let's first off increase the twirl radius to 100% and we'll set the angle up to 10. So we get this very twisted look. And then we'll also add the optics compensation effect, reverse it, and we'll also increase the field of view like crazy. So you can see without the adjustment layer and then with the adjustment layer. We'll set this to 140 as well. Now let's also animate the cylinder to come in. So we'll shut these off and we'll animate the original copy. So we'll go over to the position all the way at the start here. I don't know why these got scrubbed over, but we'll bring them back. And we'll set a keyframe for the position Z. And we'll bring this all the way at the start here so we can not see it at the beginning. And then we'll go over to 5 seconds and we'll push it in the other direction, just before we get to see the edges there. And we'll also animate the Y rotation. So if we increase that, you can see what's happening, but just make sure we go in the negative so that the direction matches with the other elements. And we'll set a keyframe, set it to 0, hit U, bring this at the start, and then at the end, we'll do like 5 cycles. And we'll copy both of these values and we'll select this copy and just paste it to that. So now the same thing is happening to both copies. We can turn them on. Turn on the distortion as well, and there you go. So we'll hit N to bring up the work area end. Again, you can make it as long as you want, but we did base the timing around this line element, which was 3.5 seconds long, but we're giving it a couple of extra seconds here at the end for all these other elements so that we have enough to cover the entire animation, but we can even speed it up afterwards if we want to. Now, once we have all of our elements, we can go back to the project panel and we'll render out all of these elements so we can finally composite them back together. Now let's go over to the stars and let's duplicate that. And we'll call this stars tut small and then star tuts big. And if we go inside of that, let's make sure the big stars are enabled on the big comp and then the small stars are enabled in the small comp. Now we'll select all of these, hold down Control, Cylinder, Fractal Spiral, go over to Composition, Add to Render Queue, and you can set them to QuickTime. By the way, we don't need the transparency because we're gonna set them all to screen mode, so they're gonna blend with each other either way. And then you can hit OK and do the same thing for those. Maybe create a preset here so you can just set them all at the same time, set the destination as well, and then you can finally hit render. All right, now once you're done with rendering all of those elements, you can bring them in. So we'll select one of them, hold down Shift, select the bottom one, and then click and drag them into the comp. And first of all, let's just set them all to screen so they blend with each other. And you can see we have this huge mess. Now, first of all, let's bring the line at the top here, maybe change that to orange. Then we have the stars, big and small, just to organize things a little bit. And now before we tweak the opacity values, let's just add the main effects. So we'll go over to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll type in Effect, change the color of that. I really like using these color labels. They just clear up your head a little bit. So we'll select this, click Control Space, and we'll add the twirl effect one more time. And we'll do maybe 4 at the start, and also make sure you increase the twirl radius, because if this is lower than 100, you can see it doesn't cover the entire comp. So we'll just go over to 100, and we'll also set a keyframe here, and we'll go over to 5 seconds, and we'll set this to like 6, so it's constantly spinning. Now we'll also add an optics compensation effect. We'll increase this to 130 and make sure you're on the reverse. Again, this is looking way too crazy right now, but this is where we can start playing around with the opacity values. So maybe we'll set the line to like 75% and we'll bring this at the top. We'll set the stars small to like 100%. Maybe the stars big, maybe 50. And then the cylinder and the fractal spiral, these two elements are gonna serve just to like fill in some gaps. So they're not gonna be as visible. So we'll set the cylinder to like very low, 10%. We'll just solo that. So you can see it's barely visible. And we'll also set the fractal spiral to like 25% or so. So now after we unsolo these, you can see all of the elements together. And if we switch back to maybe half, you can see the main focus is on the line and the stars streaks. Now, if we turn those off, you can see it just looks a bit too empty, but then with those, they kind of fill in the entire space. Now let's go back to the effect layer and we'll add an effect called vector blur. And this just kind of blurs things out in a very weird kind of way. So if we increase the amount just slightly here to like 15% or so, you can see it gives this very liquidy kind of look, but it also helps with blending all of these elements with each other. And you can play around with these settings, maybe change the type, but I found that the natural looks the best in this case. And then there's also a few more options here. You can even choose to use a vector map, but in this case, we don't want to because we want this to affect the entire comp. Next up, let's quickly just zoom in here towards the edges and we'll solo out one of these elements so we have the line. Okay, here we go. You can see because of the optics compensation effect, there's this weird aliasing that goes on towards the edges especially. To get rid of that, what we can do is to blur out those edges. So we'll add a camera lens blur effect. And we'll increase this to 30. Now, what happens is this just blurs out the entire image, and that's not quite what we want. Instead, we want to only blur the edges. And the camera lens blur effect allows us to do that by using a blur map. Now, before we create the blur map, let's just also repeat edge pixels so we don't get this weird blurring at the edges. Now, let's go over to Layer, New Solid, and we'll type in blur map and also Control Space, add a gradient ramp. And we'll solo that out for a moment so we can render faster. We'll set the ramp shape to radial ramp, and then we'll drag this top point and we'll put it in the middle there. Maybe even set the value here to 540 so we know it's perfectly in the center. Then we can maybe put it lower like so. And remember, wherever there are bright values, those areas are going to be blurred, and wherever there are dark values, those areas are not going to be blurred. Now we'll go back to the blur map one more time and we'll add a levels adjustment. So we can give it a bit more contrast here. So towards the center, we don't want any blur. And then towards the edges, we can have a more faded blur. And we can come back to this and tweak it later on just so we can see how everything is looking. So now we'll shut this off because we don't need to see it. And we'll go back to the camera lens blur effect and we'll select that blur map layer and just make sure you're also using the effects and masks. Now, if we switch back to full and zoom in here, you can see that it's more blurred towards the edges, but not so much towards the center. But as you can see, towards the center here, there's actually a slight problem. We're still getting the blur. And I remember that was an issue with the levels adjustment because we're using 32 bits per channel. You can see down here, clip to output black and white. Those are off for 32 bits per channel. So just make sure these are set to on. And now you'll notice that it's rendering properly. So if you go back to the effect layer, we can turn off the camera lens blur effect and then turn it back on. And if you notice here, this area towards the edges is being blurred, but not so much towards the center. By the way, we're also having some issues with the edges of our comp, and that's because of the vector blur effect. But once we pre-compose all of these at the end and colorize them, we'll just scale up the entire comp slightly by like 1 or 2%, and that should get rid of those. Now, finally, let's also add a fast box blur effect to the effect layer. And we'll do a very slight blur, like 0.5 with 1 iterations, just to slightly smooth out the aliasing that we have present. And also repeat the edge pixels. All right, so let's now start animating this. So we'll go over to Layer, New Solid. We'll call this Start. Make sure this is black and hit OK. Then we'll grab the ellipse tool and then click and drag on the middle. Hold down Control and Shift to scale it proportionally. And what we want to do is have this sort of effect where the mask is scaled up like so, and then it gets scaled down, in turn giving us this sort of reveal kind of animation. So we'll leave it there. We'll hit F, bring up the feather, and we'll set like the end point. So what we want to do is have it be right there at the end. And remember, what we're trying to do is have the effects not be as visible towards the end so we don't see those weird bending points. Maybe we'll turn the feather back down a bit. And also, let's see, maybe we'll turn off the camera lens blur and the vector blur, and we'll turn this back to full so we can see in full resolution what is going on. But these couple of effects don't slow us down as much. Maybe we'll even do half. So we can now select this and make adjustment to it, tighten it down a bit more, decrease the feather. And now we'll hit MM to bring up the mask properties. We'll set a keyframe for the mask path, and then we'll go back to the start here, double click on the mask, and then we'll hold down Control Shift again and just increase it until we can no longer see any element. And then we'll select this one, maybe 75% that, and we'll quickly preview how that's looking. So you can see it's kind of revealing itself. Maybe even push it over like so. And maybe even animate the feather so it comes to this point, but at the start, it's more feathered. And maybe we can even play around with the timing of these layers as well, so we can have the line come in earlier. And maybe even put the line on top of this start layer, so we can get to see this main element before we get to see everything else. So maybe push the timing like so. And seeing as we animated the line to vanish at the end, that just disappears by itself. But now we have the problem of still having these other elements visible. So what we'll do is just duplicate this layer where we have the ellipse shape added. We'll hit MM to bring up the mask path, and we'll set this to subtract. And let's just shut these stopwatches off and we'll reanimate it. So we'll go over to the end here. We'll just double click on it, scale it up so we can't see it all the way up until the end. you can see where this is going. So we'll animate the mask path across a few frames here. Just before the line vanishes, we already want all of those other elements to not be visible anymore. So we'll drop that down like so, and we'll go back here and we'll hit F9 on this, maybe 75% that, and just play around with the timing. Maybe just bring this over. In fact, as you can see over here at the end, this just looks very weird the way that those are being faded out. So what we want to do is maybe have them scale down as well. So let's just take care of the line first of all. Maybe at this point where the line is just about starting to vanish, we'll select the line, hit S to bring up the scale. We'll set a keyframe there, and then we'll go over all the way at the end here and we'll scale it down a lot. And so what that does is giving us this illusion that it is being sucked even more at the end. And we'll do that same thing with the stars as well. So we'll select the stars small and stars big, set a keyframe for both of those. And let's see, where does the fade start? So around here, we'll set them to ease, go over here at the end, and we'll scale them down a lot just before we get to see those edges. So that's an extra layer of animation. I'm thinking maybe at the end here, it's just way too slow the way this is animating off. So maybe we'll drag this over. All right, so as far as the compositing stage goes, I think we're pretty happy with what we got so far. Again, keep in mind, we're really not going to be able to get the same result as we did in the original example, just because I did spend a lot more time tinkering with that version as opposed to with this. All right, now let's go back to the project panel, and one last time we'll click and drag this into a new comp, which is going to be our beautify comp. So we'll call this final beautification. And we'll add a new adjustment layer. We'll call this colorization. Now, there's a bunch of colorization effects that we could use when it comes to After Effects, but one cool effect we could add is the colorama effect. So we can type in colorama. And what this effect allows you to do is to take all of those grayscale values and apply different kinds of colors to different kinds of values. So if we turn this on, go to output cycle, there's a bunch of presets here. So for example, we could say set this to RGB. So now it's mapping the red, green, and blue colors to different kinds of values. And you can tweak the look by adjusting the points on the circle here. There's a bunch of other presets as well. For example, you got this fire, which is pretty cool looking. Then there's one called Caribbean, which looks kind of like water. And there's a very interesting option here that says interpolate palette. And if we uncheck that, what this does is it removes any gradients or any smoothing that happens in between different kinds of values. And in turn, you're left with this cell shading look. So it's now looking kind of like water animation that you would see in like anime shows, for example. And it's really funny how we've been referencing anime throughout this tutorial. Something is afoot. But anyway, I just quickly wanted to mention this cool effect because it actually works very well with how we set up our textures beforehand. So remember when we added the fractal noise effect to the CC starburst so that those particles would have different kinds of grayscale values? Well, that now comes in handy when using this effect. But anyway, we'll delete this and we'll use another effect called VC Color Vibrance, which is also from Video Copilot, and it is totally free. And what it allows you to do is to just sample a color. So we'll do like blue or something like that. And then just play around with these settings to get whatever kind of look you want. Now, again, you don't have to use this, but it is a very powerful and free plugin. Now, let's just disable that for a moment and let's quickly go through how we would maybe colorize this without using the color vibrance. So we'll add a curves effect and we'll go over to red, maybe pump up the red, and we'll go over to blue, maybe turn that down a bit, and maybe go over to green and just give it some contrast like so. So we get this very orange fiery look, and maybe add a hue and saturation effect, just give it some more saturation, and then maybe play around with the master hue here. And that's one way to do it. But again, we'll just delete these and we'll worry about a single color value, and this effect just handles everything else for us. We'll pick a color, let's just see here, maybe more icy look. And maybe we can switch to half. By the way, I do remember that back here, we turned off the vector blur and the camera lens blur. So let's bring those back on. And you can see the vector blur just does so much to give it a bit of character. You may notice here at the edges, we're seeing those problems that we have with the vector blur. So a quick fix for that, just hit S, bring up the scale. We'll do like 101 or maybe 102, or maybe even just slightly more, until we can no longer see those edges. Now you can see here we have the vibrance, which sort of acts as our saturation control, but we'll leave that at 1. Then you have the brightness and then the gamma. So there's some really cool controls here. And what we'll do is add a few glow effects. So let's control space, add a glow effect. First of all, let's dial down the intensity here. And what I like to do is when I'm adding glow, I like to add 3 copies of it. Have the first one to be very tight, like maybe 50 radius. We'll decrease this. And not so intense, so like 0.1 or 0.2. Then we'll duplicate this and we'll increase the radius, so like 400. Play around with the threshold so we're not grabbing so much. And then maybe set this down to 0.1. And then finally, one last copy, and we'll set this to be like 1000 or so. And then back here, maybe we'll set this back to like 0.1. So if we drop these down, you see without glow, then the first copy just intensifies those bright values. It's really tight, then it's more faded, and then all the way it's even more faded. And I'm thinking this last copy could maybe be set to 0.05, so it's not as intense. And remember, I'm doing all this work on quarter, so let's just switch back to full so we can see how that actually looks like. So again, without the glow effects, and then with the glow effects. Now let's also add a hue and saturation. Maybe we'll boost the saturation a little bit. And then finally a curves effect, just to give it a bit of contrast. Then we'll add an effect called CC Vignette. And this just acts a vignette. And what we'll do is increase the amount to 200. And we'll set the angle of view down to like 35. This is like how much the vignette is focused. So if we increase this, it's really dialed in the center, but we want a more faded look. So we'll set it to like 35. And we'll also make sure to pin the highlights to 100%. And what this value does is it gets rid of any vignetting where there are bright values. So you can see there's a vignette around the line here as well. But when we set this to 100, you can see the line doesn't get affected as much. So if we turn the vignette back on and off, there's a vignette towards the edges because these values aren't as bright, but not the line itself. And keep in mind, we can lock this comp, go back to the main comp, and just play around with the opacity values here. So if we increase this all the way to 100%, this will be blown out even more. Then we have control over the stars and all these things. So just keep that in mind. Now I'll also show you one sweet little effect called HDR highlight compression. And what this allows you to do is just compress those highlights. And there's also an amount value here, so we can maybe set that to 50, just in case you don't want to go back and tweak around all of these other settings to like dial in the exposure. Instead, you can use this simple utility effect and just maybe set it to 50%. So you can see without and then with. All right, so that's the look of it. Now let's quickly add a logo to this. So we'll go ahead, create a new composition. We'll rename this to logo tut. Hit OK. And under the materials here, I have a logo of mine. So we'll click and drag that into the comp, and that should position it in the center. Right now, we can't really see it because this is black, I believe. So we'll control space, add a fill effect, set that to white, and then we'll scale this down to like 5. And the reason we're putting this logo into its own comp is because later on, we can just change this logo and it'll automatically update on our final comp. So let's drag the logo tut comp underneath. Also make sure you set this to screen just in case we can't see it. And as you can see, because we have the colorization adjustment layer on top, it also affects the logo itself. So you can see the logo has these sort of fringing edges here, which are kind of white. To get rid of any issues, let's go over to the logo here and we'll create a new solid. Make sure it's black and we'll set that below. And this way we don't have any issues around our edges. Now let's go back to quarter. Let's turn this back on and let's find the point where we want our logo to show up. So right around here, maybe we want the logo to start appearing. So what we'll do is grab the logo tut here. We'll hit S to bring up the scale. We'll also hold down Shift, hit T to bring up the opacity while also keeping the scale. We'll set a keyframe for that. And let's just go over a few frames here to maybe like 3 seconds, set keyframes again, and then go back here. And first of all, let's just scale this up a bit to like 200%. Go over by 10 frames. So hold down Shift and hit page down to move forward by 10 frames each. And then we'll snap this here. You can hold down Shift to snap keyframes to your timeline. We'll select both of these, maybe hit F9, and we'll go maybe over by 10, 20, 30, 40 frames, and we'll slide this over and also select it, right click, 75%. And we'll also make sure it's set to 0% all the way at the beginning here. Now, if we preview this, now that's not that amusing. Maybe we'll set this to like 100%. So it immediately starts scaling down, and maybe even just scale it down a bit at the beginning. All right, now let's also add an effect called radial wipe. And this basically serves to match this sort of spiral reveal kind of animation. So we'll go over at a point here where we see the line start to vanish. So maybe around here. And we'll set the transition completion frame right there. And we'll move forward. Which way do we have to? Okay, so we have to do counterclockwise. Yep, like so. Hit U, bring up the keyframes. We'll set that to be the first keyframe. And then over here, we want it to be revealed. And we'll go forward by maybe 20 frames. Hit F9 to ease that. And we'll do 75%. You probably know by now, 75% is my favorite number. And we'll also increase the feather. So we get this smooth transition. Now I also added some rotation. Instead of rotating the actual rotation value of the layer here, we're gonna add a transform effect. So we'll do Control Space Transform. And the reason we're doing that is because if we adjust the rotation value, that messes up the orientation or the angle of our radial wipe. So instead, what we're gonna do is put the transform effect above the radial wipe. And now if we increase the rotation value, you can see the radial wipe angle still stays in the same spot. So we'll bring this back to 0, set a keyframe there, hit U, we'll bring this over to the same spot here as the radial wipe maybe. We'll do like minus 180 degrees. Slide this over, F9, 75%. And now you can see it's spinning, scaling down, and also transitioning with a radial wipe. You may also notice that there's a slight glow and the logo is colorized even at the end. So what we want to do is also animate the opacity of our colorization adjustment layer. So we'll go over to 224, set a keyframe there, move forward a bit, and then set this to 0%. And then hold down Alt and square bracket to trim it there. So now we can maybe even ease those, and now it's sort of colorized. And then at the end, it just fades out and we're left with this flat logo. Another thing we can do is add some rays to our logo. So let's add a radial fast blur. We'll set the zoom to brightest and then increase the amount so we get this look. Animate the amount here towards the end to just fade out. So at the start here, we can see the rays, and then towards the end, we can no longer see them. Another detail we could add is maybe a fast box blur. So we'll add a fast box blur and we'll increase this to like 10. And over the course of like 10 frames, it just quickly clears up. If we hit U to bring up those keyframes, this is the fast box blur. We'll hit F9 on those. So at the start here, it's kind of blurry, maybe not so much, maybe like 5, and then it emerges like so. Again, it's all up to you. You can add these details, you can choose not to. Now, finally, one last thing I added was a lens flare effect. So let's go over to Layer, New Solid, and we'll call this Flare. And we'll add the lens flare effect, which is built into After Effects. And this just contains a few settings here. You got the flare brightness, the flare position, some lens presets as well. So we can maybe leave it at 35mm prime. And you can also blend with original, which just blends it with the layer itself. But we'll leave that at 0%. And we'll add a tint effect, so there's no color. But once we drop it below the colorization, you can see it turns blue because of all the effects that we have applied to this. So you can see how efficient everything is. If we set this to screen, because we set everything up to be linked to one color vibrance effect, we can now just change this single color. So we can maybe go for a fiery look like so. All right, we'll go back to blue for now. Now let's quickly go ahead and also add a CC radial fast blur on the lens flare. Let's just make sure it's centered, so 1960 by 540. And the reason I'm adding the CC radial fast blur is because without it, it's a bit too sharp. And what we'll do is call this flare tight. And this is gonna be our sort of small flare. And we'll set the opacity to 100%, and we'll do like flare brightness 25. And let's unsolo it, and let's find a point where we want this to turn on. So okay, so right here, we want the flare to be at 100%, or in this case, 25%. So we'll set a keyframe there. We'll move backwards by 5 frames, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hit the page down key, by the way. We'll set this back to 0. Then we'll go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll hold down Shift and hit page down again, which will move forward by 10 frames. And we'll set this back to 0 again. Then we'll hit U, select all of these, and then hit F9 to easy ease them. And then we can also trim these to the corresponding keyframes. So we have this sort of flash happening as the logo gets revealed. And then one more thing we can do is duplicate this, and we'll rename this to Flare Wide. And we'll hit U to bring up the flare brightness, and we'll set this to 100%. Then we'll hit T to bring up the opacity, and we'll set the opacity down to like 25%. And then maybe we can even increase the fast blur here, and we'll go back to the flare tight and maybe decrease that. And this way we have a more focused flare at the center, and then this one is more wide. Another thing we can do is maybe select both of these and parent them to the logo comp, and this way they also scale up with the logo. And remember, you can go back to the logo comp and just switch this out for whatever you want. So maybe we'll type in, I don't know, And once we go back to the final comp, you can see that in motion. You might have to play around with the radial wipe and the way you want this logo to show up, but I guess this effect works best with circular logos. Okay, so here's a quick full preview of what we have so far, and I'm noticing a couple of things. First of all, the line here is a bit too sharp, I think, and I believe in the original example, I blurred it out a bit. So if we go over to the main comp, select the line, we can add a fast box blur effect. We can just blur it out a bit, make sure repeat edge pixels are enabled. And now it sort of blends more with the other elements here. As you can see, you have full control over how you want this to look. Feel free to experiment and try whatever things you want. It's all up to you. And I cannot stress this enough. The purpose of these tutorials is not to get a perfect recreation of what I already had. Instead, I just want to make sure that I cover all of the techniques and effects that were used to achieve these effects, just to give you a better understanding as to how After Effects works, and hopefully how you can use these techniques and benefit from them in your own projects. Alright, so with all that said, let's move on to the outro of this video. Alright guys, thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Remember, you can download the project files for free, so check the description for that. Consider subscribing and hitting that bell button to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you're interested in following my work or want to ask me any questions personally, then here are all of my social links. If you have any questions or suggestions, then feel free to leave a comment down below. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.